Good afternoon, everyone there. I'll start my presentation by telling you the background of EvalIndigenous, the objectives and the structure, and then we'll go into the programs. And then Debbie will finish off telling you about what we have been doing on the Global VOPE survey and Voices project. EvalIndigenous basically is an international subcommittee of the EvalPartners group. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership, and you are aware that with the coming in of the SDGs and not leaving anyone behind, the focus has now been to be all-inclusive in development. And that's how EvalIndigenous started working into trying to make it on the international platform, especially regarding indigenous people. And what are we calling indigenous peoples? In EvalIndigenous, we've taken the approach that is used by the United Nations, which argues that it's more beneficial to identify rather than define indigenous peoples and to take into account the diversity of indigenous people across the globe. According to the UN, the most fruitful approach is to identify rather than define indigenous peoples. This is based on the fundamental criterion of self-identification as underlined in a number of human rights documentation. And we have, for a long time, seen that evaluations are done mostly by transient evaluators. They are unfamiliar with the cultural realities, protocols, and community contexts where they perform evaluation in indigenous communities. Now is the time for indigenous peoples to reclaim that evaluative framework and even put in their own evaluative frameworks and processes in order to strengthen and make evaluation more authentic in both the indigenous and non-indigenous communities. We recognize as well what has already been done by the evaluation communities, and we bring forward both worldviews together to provide an authentic approach to cultural responsiveness. Now, some people say indigenous is a negative term. So we accept the terms that are used by the ethnic groups wherever they are found, yeah, whether they call themselves peasants or indigenous people or another name. We accept that as long as there is the cultural context that is being accepted. Now, what are the objectives of EvalIndigenous? It intends to advance the involvement of indigenous people in leading and contributing to a global evaluation practice and endeavors, to facilitate spaces to promote indigenous people's self-determination of the evaluation agenda. The long-term outcomes, we expect that indigenous people will self-determine their evaluation agenda. And there is a global recognition, understanding of indigenous knowledge and methods by the global evaluation community. The structure of EvalIndigenous. The EvalIndigenous network has a committee which is being chaired by Bremner Rari and co-chaired by Debbie Goodwin. There's also a global context task force that's being chaired by Dr. Nick Bowman. She's from the United States, and the practitioner task force that is being chaired by Dr. Fiona Cram. She's from New Zealand. Now, the Global Context Task Force. This hopes to document and celebrate the global context of the indigenous evaluations, including the diverse cultural, linguistic, and legal political governance, policies and practices of indigenous communities around the world. It also is coordinating with other VOPEs and networks. Then the Practitioners Task Force focuses on documenting the methods and practices utilized by indigenous practitioners of evaluation. So all those methodologies that are used in the field are being documented. And when we are talking about indigenous evaluators, we recognize that some are not professional evaluators as per se, but they still undertake evaluative activities. For example, elders, educators in communities, community counselors, support workers, and recreation workers. We are including those. So what are the objectives of the Practitioners Task Force? It seeks out and engages with indigenous practitioners of evaluation around the globe. It connects indigenous practitioners of evaluation for the purposes of networking, peer support, and the sharing of evaluation methodologies and practices. Then it strengthens the capabilities of indigenous practitioners of evaluation through peer learning and the development of local support networks. Then the task force also supports the documentation and dissemination of indigenous evaluation methodologies so that this knowledge is accessible to aspiring indigenous evaluation practitioners and indigenous communities. It also advocates for the rights of indigenous peoples to have evaluation undertaken by their own indigenous practitioners of evaluation. Now, this fits in the global evaluation agenda of 2016 to 2020, which is as follows: strengthen the enabling environment for evaluation, strengthen the institutional capacities of voluntary organization for professional evaluation. Those are the VOPEs and civil society. Then strengthen individual evaluators' capacity development. Then have interlinkages between enabling environment, institutional, and individual capacities. So what are the activities of EvalIndigenous? It's a development of partnerships and of broad-based networks. So since the Kathmandu NEPO meeting of EvalPartners, it has been working on trying to put itself on the global evaluation map. It prepared the concept paper for EvalIndigenous as a group, so that it could start working and trying to get the voices of indigenous practitioners to be heard. So it's been strengthening the network by reaching out to potential partners, VOPEs and the indigenous people, communities and groups that they support and represent globally. Then we had in Bishkek the launch of EvalIndigenous at the EvalPartners Global Evaluation Forum of April 2017. There, it tried to link up to the pillars of all the EvalPartners and came up with an action plan and an engagement in country-led initiative, including establishing relationships with donors and funders. The current activities: we have a task force monthly meeting, and we are currently having a Voices project of trying to document or video record voices of practitioners out there in the field. We are also preparing a conference concept paper for 2019. Then we're still going out to try and network with local and regional indigenous people and the organizations. We've been working on the strategic plan and the funding accountability documents. We've also been working on the communication strategy, trying to get publicity using social media, Facebook, coming up with our own website and through YouTube and the webinars. Then we've been going out to try and document indigenous perspectives around the world on evaluations and development. Then we are coming up with a list of contacts and members across the globe. So the potential partners of EvalIndigenous that we have identified, we have the global evaluation community. This is the indigenous people, communities and groups. Then we have the VOPEs. Then we have the usual commissioners of evaluations, the donors, funders, then the academias and the people's representatives in parliament. Then we have the EvalPartners network, the Eval Youth, Eval Gender, Eval SDG, and the Parliamentarians Forum.